Way back in 1893, a speech by Swami Vivekananda in Chicago became this legendary moment for spiritual unity. I mean, it's celebrated everywhere for its message of harmony. But what happens when you put that beautiful vision under a really critical microscope? Well, in this explainer, we're going to deconstruct a detailed critique of that very speech, and we'll look at the arguments that really challenge its famous legacy.
And this right here, this is the line that everyone remembers. It really captures the heart of the speech's message. This incredible vision of a world where every single spiritual path is seen as true and is respected. It's a really powerful and inclusive idea that, just blew people away at the time, and it still inspires so many today. But the analysis we're digging into actually questions the very foundation of this message. All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start by quickly going over the famous core arguments of the speech, just to set the scene. Then, we'll dive right into the critique from our source material, breaking it down into 3 different layers: supposed factual errors, logical fallacies, and even cognitive biases. And at the end, we'll bring it all together for a final critical reevaluation. Okay, first things first, let's talk about what made Vivekananda's speech so incredibly impactful to begin with. The source we're looking at identifies several key pillars that really propped up his entire address. And understanding these is absolutely crucial before we jump into the critique. So to really get the critique, you first have to feel the power of the original speech. Vivekananda built his case on a few core ideas. He argued that religious truth is universal. He positioned Hinduism as this uniquely tolerant and compassionate faith, one that could even absorb other beliefs. He called for all religions to unite. He stressed that serving other people was itself a spiritual path, and he put forward karma as a better explanation for suffering than what other religions offered. It's his incredibly powerful message that's about to get challenged. And here is where we make the turn. The first part of this critique really challenges the speech on the facts. The source basically argues that some of the most powerful claims just don't really line up with the historical record. So the key point here is this direct contradiction. On one hand, you have Vivekananda's claim of an inherently tolerant religion, but on the other, the source points to the reality of the caste system. The analysis argues, how can a system with such deep-rooted structural discrimination be described as fundamentally tolerant? It suggests the portrayal in the speech was, incomplete at best. Next up, the critique takes on how Hinduism itself was presented philosophically. Vivekananda really focused his message on Advaita, this idea of non-dualism. But the source points out that this is just one of several major schools of thought in Hinduism. So the argument is that presenting Advaita as the single core of the religion is a misrepresentation. It kind of glosses over this rich diversity and, frankly, the historical conflicts between different philosophical traditions within the faith. And this is a big one. The claim that Hinduism is the mother of all religions gets framed in the critique as a massive oversimplification. The source material argues that this idea just completely ignores the unique and independent origins of other major world faiths, which makes it a pretty questionable claim from a historical standpoint. Okay, let's move on to the second layer of this analysis. This is where it gets interesting because it builds on the first part. We're moving beyond just the factual claims. Now the source looks at the very structure of Vivekananda's arguments, and it identifies what it calls several logical fallacies. So the argument here is that underneath all the inspiring words, the speech's logic is built on some pretty shaky ground. The source points to several logical fallacies. These are basically flaws in reasoning that can make an argument sound way more convincing than it actually is. Let's break down a few key examples. The first one is called appeal to tradition. According to the source, the speech doesn't just mention Hinduism's ancient roots as a historical fact, it uses that age as proof of its superiority and its truthfulness. The logical trap here is thinking that just because something is ancient, it has to be correct or better. But as the critique points out, age doesn't equal accuracy. Next, we've got hasty generalization. This is when you draw a really big conclusion from just a little bit of evidence. The critique connects this back to the claim of universal tolerance. It argues that by focusing only on the tolerant ideals, the speech kind of ignores all the historical and ongoing examples of intolerance within the tradition. So it creates this generalized and ultimately incomplete picture. The source also calls out a false dilemma. It argues that the speech basically gives you only 2 choices for the world's religions. Either you have bitter fighting and exclusivism, or you have complete unity where all religions are basically the same. This, the critique says,
totally ignores other perfectly valid options, like pluralism, where different religions can coexist respectfully without having to all become one thing. All right, now for the final layer of the critique. This part goes even deeper than facts or logic. It explores the actual psychology behind the speech. The source looks at potential cognitive biases, the mental shortcuts our brains use all the time, that might have shaped the message and how people received it. So the source points to a few common biases. There's in-group bias, that's our natural tendency to favor our own group, or self-serving bias, where we credit our successes to ourselves but blame our failures on other things. The idea here is that these kinds of subconscious mental patterns played a really key role in how the speech's arguments were put together. So what happens when you put all these alleged biases together? Well, according to the source, you get a narrative that's pretty unbalanced. For example, it points to that self-serving bias, where positive things like philosophical depth get credited to Hinduism, while negative things like suffering in the world are framed as problems that other religions just can't solve, but that Hinduism, thanks to karma, can. Okay, let's pull all these different threads together. We've looked at challenges to the speech's facts, its logic, and the potential psychological factors at play. This final part of our explainer is going to summarize the entire critique that's laid out in our source material. This table really boils it all down, doesn't it? It sorts the alleged flaws into three main buckets: factual errors, which clash with history; logical errors, which involve flawed reasoning; and cognitive errors, which are driven by our unconscious biases. The source even mentions a fourth type, epistemological errors, which is about how we know what we know, but it really focuses its deep dive on these first three. And that brings us to our final thought here. Look, the point of this explainer wasn't to give a thumbs up or thumbs down, but to walk through one very specific, very detailed critique of a famous historical moment. So the question it really leaves us with is this: how does this kind of deep, critical analysis change the way we understand an iconic text and its legacy? Does it diminish it, or does it just add more layers, more complexity to the story? That's for you to decide.